In 2023, new revelations gave new light to cases that have gone cold for years, even decades. We're taking a look back at some of the year's biggest breaks in the case, starting right here in New York with the man now dubbed the Gilgo Beach serial killer. In July, authorities arrested an architect for a string of unsolved murders involving the slayings of multiple women whose bodies were discovered along Gilgo Beach in 2010.
I'm standing here with my law enforcement partners in the Gilgo Task Force to announce the indictment of defendant Rex Andrew Heuermann, 59 years of age.
Rex Heuermann is a demon that walks among us, a predator that ruined families.
The case stems from the discovery of human remains found on Gilgo Beach between 2010 and 2011. 4 of the victims were found buried underneath each other, cops dubbing them as the Gilgo Four. Police identified the 4 as Megan Waterman, Melissa Bartholomew, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes. While their bodies were discovered in 2010, the case goes back even further, with clues pointing to Heuermann along the way. According to court records, in 2007, Maureen Brainerd Barnes was living in Connecticut at the time. She was contacted by a burner phone more than a dozen times between July 6th and July 9th. And on July 9th, there was not a sighting of her since. Her phone was last traced to Midtown Manhattan. 2 years later, in 2009, Melissa Bartholomew was also contacted by a burner phone on July 3rd, 6th, 9th, and 10th. According to court records, she was last seen on July 10th in New York City. And cell phone site records reveal the burner phone was traced back to Massapequa Park, where Heuermann lived, and Midtown Manhattan, where he worked. The following year, in 2010, victim Megan Waterman also was contacted by a burner phone. Officials say Waterman communicated with the burner phone up until June 6th of that year, when authorities say she was last seen leaving a Holiday Inn in upstate New York, marking the last time she was ever seen alive. Cell phone records reveal the phone was traced back to Massapequa Park near Heuermann's home. And in 2010, months before the bodies were discovered, Amber Costello was also contacted by a burner phone. According to witnesses, when a client entered her home, Costello's roommate, who pretended to be Costello's boyfriend, came face to face with her killer, later giving an eyewitness account of the suspect: 6'4" to 6'6", mid-40s, dark bushy hair, and 1970s type glasses. The burner phone was used to contact Costello again that night, as authorities traced it back to Midtown Manhattan and Massapequa Park. For years, the public and the victims' families were kept in the dark about any leads for a suspect. In 2020, investigators found a hair on one of the victims that was submitted for DNA analysis, confirming the hair belonged to a male. In 2022, police identified Heuermann as a suspect in Costello's murder after linking his pickup truck with a witness who reported seeing it in 2010. Then more clues. Court documents showed Heuermann used his American Express card in the same area where he used the burner phone to contact the victims. That same credit card also had links to the dating app Tinder, which was linked to the burner phone and a burner email that searched for sex workers as well as sadistic and torture-related pornography. Then in January 2023, detectives recover a pizza box the engineer threw away and were able to take swabs from the leftover crust to tie the suspect to the murders. So with the help of witnesses, DNA, phone records, and a pizza box, investigators found their match. And in July, Heuermann was arrested in connection to 3 of the murders: Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. But prosecutors say he's also the prime suspect in the murder of Maureen Brainerd Barnes. He pleaded not guilty to all charges and previously, through his lawyer, maintained his innocence.
Obviously, the district attorney's office has a whole office. They're the biggest law firm in this county. I'm one guy, right? So Ms. Koish is going to be co-counsel on this. We have other attorneys that I expect, are going to be assisting on this. And just to pour through the discovery is an enormous task, but we're prepared for it, and we're going to do it. And whether it's a year and a half or 2 years, whenever that day comes, we're going to go in a court of law, and we're looking forward to defending this case. There's no plea deal. He said from the moment I met him that I did not do this. So we're prepared to go forward. We will defend this case in a court of law, and we will go to trial in this case.
Heuermann is back in court in February. Next, we're in Ohio, where the fiancé of a missing art student who vanished more than a decade ago was arrested in March in connection to her death. Authorities arrested John Carter on murder charges for the death of his fiancée, Caitlin Markham. Markham was last seen in August 2011, but her remains weren't found until 2 years later across state lines in Indiana. Loved ones of Markham previously told reporters the 22-year-old had great hopes for her future. She was about to graduate from the Art Institute of Cincinnati, and she was saving up her money to move to Colorado with her fiancé. On the night of her disappearance, Markham arrived to her condo around 9 p.m. Her fiancé, John Carter, was already there but later left to meet up with friends for a bonfire before returning to his home, which he shared with his mother. Carter initially told investigators that he last heard from Markham just before 1 a.m. on August 14, 2011. Later that same morning, he sent her a good morning text but said he never heard back. Carter claims that he didn't hear from her all day, later going back to her condo to check on her, only to find her car in the driveway, her dog inside, but no Caitlin. He called 911 and told the operator she was missing. Once Fairfield police began their investigation, days and days passed, but no sign of Caitlin. Dozens of volunteers searched near her home and in local neighborhoods, but still no sign of her. After Caitlin's disappearance, Carter played the role of a worried fiancé, telling local reporters he believed she was still alive. After years of searching for any clues as to where Caitlin could be, on April 7, 2013, there was finally a break in the case. 30 miles away from Caitlin's condo on a rural road, a couple found human remains appearing to be a human jaw and a skull with hair attached inside a grocery bag. Authorities used dental records to confirm the remains were from Caitlin, ultimately ruling her death as a homicide, but it still wouldn't be until a decade later that an arrest was finally made. That day first came in February 2023 when a friend of Caitlin's named Jonathan Palmerton was arrested on perjury charges after being accused of lying to investigators. That charge was ultimately dismissed. Then the next month, Caitlin's fiancé was arrested, bringing relief to Caitlin's family, who had their suspicions of Carter for years. Carter pleaded not guilty and remains free after a $1 million bond was posted on his behalf. The case is scheduled to go to trial in June of 2024. Next, we head to Massachusetts, where investigators used an unlikely item and the help of a popular HBO television show to crack their case. In February, authorities arrested DeVaris Hampton for the 2011 murder of Todd Lampley. In a press release from February 2011, the Barnstable Police Department say police were dispatched to a local home where they found Lampley unconscious, bleeding, and suffering from gunshot wounds, where he was later pronounced dead at the scene. On the night of his death, investigators found shell casings and a sweet potato on the ground outside the window of the bedroom where Lampley was shot. According to reports, the potato was cut flat on one end and appeared to have a hole carved through its center. The potato appeared to have been used as a silencer. In court, prosecutors recalled a particular scene from the hit HBO show The Wire, where a sweet potato was used to mask the sound of a gunshot. Plus, it doesn't end there. The cell phone found at the scene was also registered under the name Marlo Stanfield, one of the characters from the show. It's unclear Hampton's motives for shooting Lampley. However, the two had a previous connection during a 2010 trial when Hampton implicated Lampley in the 2000 shooting death of another Massachusetts man. Next, we head to Michigan, where another item was used to crack a violent rape case from nearly 2 decades ago, along with the help from a coffee cup. Authorities arrested 51-year-old Kurt Relema in April on charges of first and second-degree criminal sexual conduct. The charges stem from 2 rape cases on golf courses, one from 1999 in Michigan, the other from 2000 in Pennsylvania. Authorities in both states used a DNA technology company to find suspects that fit their profiles, and a lab concluded their sample matched one of 3 brothers. Police were able to narrow down that list to Relema after they scooped up a DNA sample from a styrofoam coffee cup he had used. Relema is being held behind bars in Michigan without bond. If convicted, he faces up to life in prison. Next, we are in California, where a 78-year-old convicted serial killer admitted to being responsible for a 1970s cold case. John Arthur Gatu pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a second life term in prison for the 1973 death of 21-year-old Leslie Marie Perloff. Officials say Perloff's body was discovered on the hills overlooking the Stanford campus. She had a floral scarf tightly knotted around her neck that authorities say was used to strangle her. Investigators were able to break the case in 2018 with updated technology matching Gatu's DNA to DNA found under Perloff's fingernails. And in 2023, he pleaded guilty to committing the crime. Gatu was already in prison after being convicted for the 1974 murder of Janet Taylor, and prosecutors believe he committed a string of sexual assaults and at least 3 slayings. Gatu died in prison in September. His DNA remains in a state database to be compared to DNA from unsolved rapes and murders. We head back to the other side of the coast, back to Massachusetts, where the killer in a decades-old murder of a woman known as the Lady of the Dunes was identified as her very own husband. Tennessee woman Ruth Terry was discovered naked and brutally murdered on a beach in Provincetown back in 1974. She was only able to be identified with the use of investigative genealogy. The 1970s discovery of her body was gruesome. Her hands were cut off. The left side of her skull had been crushed, as her naked body was found lying on a beach and her nearly decapitated head lay on folded jeans. Her body went decades without being identified, as she was dubbed the Lady of the Dunes. After her identification, Massachusetts State Police investigators learned of her marriage to a man named Guy Moldovan in 1973 or 74. Police learned the couple had traveled for their honeymoon. Moldovan returned home, but not with his new wife. Fast forward to 5 decades later, the investigation yielded Moldovan was responsible for his wife's death. Moldovan won't have the opportunity to be tried inside a court of law. He died in 2002. Next, we are in Michigan, where advances in DNA technology gave a name to a Jane Doe who was discovered along the shores of Lake Erie more than 40 years ago. In late March of 1980, a partially decomposed body was discovered on the beach. Investigators initially determined it was a Caucasian woman between the ages of 20 to 30, 5'5", and weighing 120 pounds, wearing a size 12 disco dress. Her identity remained a mystery for decades, but after a review by a nonprofit dedicated to cracking cold cases and funding DNA testing, the woman in the disco dress was revealed to be a woman named Patricia Greenwood. Sandusky police believe Greenwood's death is possibly a homicide and hope someone who knew or even remembers Greenwood would come forward with any information to help with their investigation. Next, we head to Louisiana, where police issued arrest warrants for 2 people charged in a decades-long unsolved mystery. Delvin Sibley and Patricia Tito are both charged with second-degree murder in the death of Lester Rome. Rome's remains were dumped in an abandoned water well and went nearly 40 years without being identified, as the case went to be known as the man in the well. The case began in 1984 when the family of Lester Rome reported him missing. During the initial investigation, a woman named Patricia Tito was found living inside his home and operating his business. She at the time claimed Rome was away on business. Then in 1986, the Sabine Parish Sheriff's Office opened a homicide investigation after remains were discovered in a water well. The remains went unidentified for 35 years. That is until 2021, when they were identified as Lester Rome. Police interviewed Tito again, who was already in prison for a 2003 murder. She shared with investigators that Rome had been killed near the Gulf of Mexico in Grand Isle, Louisiana, before his remains were dumped nearly 6 hours away in Sabine Parish. In 2022, Tito brought investigators to the site of Rome's murder, telling officials that while she was present for the murder, the person responsible was a man named Delvin Sibley. Detectives later learned Lester Rome's remains were located on a property previously owned by the Sibley family. The 2 were charged with second-degree murder, but investigators say the case isn't shut just yet. Investigators with the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office are still seeking information regarding Rome's initial disappearance and Tito and Sibley's whereabouts in 1984. Next, we head to Alabama, where investigators were able to break the case when the alleged murderer confessed to the crime. Louis Spivey was taken into custody in June, shortly after serving most of a 15-year prison sentence for an unrelated crime. He confessed to fatally stabbing a pregnant mother and her son in Alabama in 2002, when he was just 18 years old at the time. 21 years ago, Alabama officers responded to a 911 call and discovered the bodies of 23-year-old Monica and her 6-year-old son, Dalton. Monica was in her 3rd trimester of her pregnancy when she was stabbed to death inside her home. Her 3-year-old son was found unharmed. Fast forward to 2023, and the convict seemingly wanted to wipe his conscience clean, as he allegedly gave investigators a complete confession outlining the crime and taking responsibility for the murders. Authorities revealed Spivey and Rollins had a previous relationship, referring to them as acquaintances. During a June press conference, officials announced their relief to finally bring answers to a family that had gone 2 decades without justice.
I know myself, when we reopened this case, when Ross got chief, it was the hardest thing to me was coming to the family and asking them were they okay with it, because they had been through, I hate to use any other word, but they've been through hell for the last 20 years, and I wanted to bring them some closure. But along with that, you know, I had the part of me that was thinking if we fail at this, you know, we have just opened these old wounds, and, you know, that was a hard choice. I mean, not gonna lie. It's something that we have been very passionate about. I think anybody that has a heart, that has spoken to this family, has seen the pain.
Spivey remains back behind bars, held with no bond. Next, we're back in Florida, where after 30 years, authorities announced they know who abducted and killed a 12-year-old girl who vanished after getting off her school bus in the 90s. In July, officials revealed a grand jury indicted 61-year-old Jeffrey Crum on charges of murder, kidnapping, and sexual battery in connection to the 1993 death of 12-year-old Jennifer Odom. Jennifer was abducted after stepping off her school bus just north of Tampa, Florida. Her body was found in a field nearly a week later with obvious signs of trauma, as investigators say she was brutally attacked and murdered. Her death launched a manhunt for the suspect, as authorities were on the lookout for a driver of a blue truck that Jennifer's classmates saw as she walked away from the bus. But it wasn't until 2015 that investigators would get a small break in their case.
That biological evidence in Pasco County was tested, and they got a full DNA profile. But that's only half the story. Once you have that profile, you have to have someone to match it to. So it was run through CODIS, which is the National DNA Database. And unfortunately, up until 2015, they had no leads on that particular DNA. But FDLE, we got to really send a big thank you to them. They were looking through some of their cases apparently and found this full profile of DNA and did something that's relatively new, and that is compare that DNA to local DNA and see if they get any hits as far as close matches, meaning somebody who may be a family member. And fortunately, they did identify a family member who happened to be the son of what turned out to be our suspect.
The analysis would be used to point authorities to Crum as their suspect, using evidence from a different case with similar circumstances. Just 13 months prior to Jennifer's kidnapping and murder, another girl was attacked and sexually assaulted after getting off her school bus.
She was getting off the school bus and was horribly attacked and sexually assaulted. Brutally is an understatement. She actually had injuries to her head and skull that were very significant, and she was left for dead. Fortunately, the victim survived, but her life was forever changed, even to this day.
Following the breakthrough, investigators worked for years gathering their evidence against Crum, who was already in prison serving a life sentence for sexual battery with a weapon. The now 62-year-old remains behind bars in the Hernando County Jail. And that concludes our look back on the year's biggest breaks in the case across the nation. As more developments and new breaks in cases occur, stick with Law&Crime for the latest. Reporting for Law&Crime Network, I'm Elizabeth Millner.